Good evening, everybody. I'm Isla Berman, the Director of Architecture at CCA, and I want to welcome you all to our first lecture of the spring semester. And it's with great pleasure that I'm able to welcome Michael Weinstock as our first lecturer. Michael is the Director of Research and Development and also the Director of the Emergent Technologies and Design program in the Graduate School of the Architectural Association in London, a school that won the 2008 ACADIA Award of Excellence for Innovative Programs. And of course, they are also the school that we are a visiting school of for our summer biodynamic structures workshop. Michael is also a founding member of the Emergence and Design Group formed in 2002 as a multidisciplinary research practice that explores the relationship between computation, material science, evolutionary systems, and architecture. The work of this group has been published in numerous contexts, including publications on morphogenetic design strategies, techniques, and technologies in AD, and the recent book, Emergent Technologies and Design Toward a Biological Paradigm for Architecture, which Michael co-authored with Michael Hensel and Achim Menges. And this is a volume that presents an overview of the research of the MTech program at the AA. Michael's recent book, The Architecture of Emergence, is an expansive scholarly contribution to the dynamics of emergent processes, understood as an architectural reading of evolutionary structures and their development through the unfolding of form in nature and human civilization. His text is certainly far-reaching in scope, a history of cultural evolution and the production of cities set within the context of the complex systems of the natural world that traces the dynamics of individual and collective metabolisms from which intelligence and social and spatial order emerge. The work draws from many fields, including the life sciences, meteorology, anthropology, archaeology, and urbanism. It also perhaps speaks to what it means to be an architect, as one that discerns embedded organizations understood as changing patterns of formation that reach critical moments of expansion, consolidation, collapse, and reorganization. His current work and forthcoming publication with Chicago University Press entitled Collective Architectures is an interdisciplinary study of growth and form of intelligent buildings in social insects and human architectures, drawing from specialists in fields such as animal behavior and theoretical biology to statistical physics and computer science. Michael has lectured and published widely, and he has served on the editorial board of AD, Architectural Design, in London since 2007. His interests, work, and research have taken him around the world in many different ways, something which certainly speaks to the far-reaching applications of what I'll call an architectural understanding. I'm very happy that Michael is with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Michael Weinstock.
Thank you, Isla, from one old white guy to another. I'm going to talk mainly about cities tonight. And I'm going to talk about how they emerged, a little bit of a kind of gap in the middle, and then I'm going to look at how we are today, and I have some questions and suggestions for you guys who are going to be designing them in your lifetime. Okay, so just want to remind you of this kind of very beautiful but scary sentence. Each generation will have to build its own city. And that's both meant literally, but also as a project to the imagination. And I'll come back to that. So the second half of my talk is going to be about that. And an analysis of kind of how we're doing and what I hope some useful suggestions. Okay. So the book and my argument generally is the metabolism is the kind of principal driver of the evolution of natural form. That's why we're this shape and why every living thing has a certain shape, but it's also the driver of how cities emerged and the forms that they have. And we're not so great at that, but what we're talking about is form and behavior and the flow of energy. So those of you who've done a little bit of physics know this bottom sentence, material energy and information, is the classical definition of a complex system. Okay. And we're used to complex systems. We live with them all the time. Mostly we don't notice. And they've all got some kind of things that you can say are common to all of them. Very simple components. In this case, just water. And immensely complicated behavior emerges from the processes of those. These are all a little image in the middle. Ice flowers, very rare, only occur when the air temperature is below the temperature of the water, and the water, as you can just about see, is on the point of freezing. Okay. Top three, of course, are all ice. And mostly my work has been about finding principles and mathematical systems from biological evolution and transporting them into computation. But in recent years, I've been looking a lot at the relation of biological evolution and cultural evolution. I'm going to do a really kind of fast forward through that tonight. And that has less power than your iPhone, and it's about the same age I am. Actually, a little younger, I think. But that's what computers used to be like. So what we're talking about are components, component systems, both in biology, computational systems, and increasingly in the way we look at physics. And the components are really simple. It's the rules of what happens in the environment that produces the form. Just a little torus in the middle, a whole field of them, varying degrees of attraction, and kind of setting forward a little bit of code to put a pulse through the environment. Everything in nature, like in human artifacts, is built from components. And again, there are certain characteristics that we can see. This is actually a computational model of a radula. Radula is like the thing you grate your parmesan with. It's the underneath of a snail. All mollusks have them. That's how they digest their food. All of these components are topologically the same, but they're a little bit varied in their geometry. And this is a real one. Electron microscope photograph. Also a radula. But it looks really architectural. You know? This could be, clean it up a little, clean up the jaggy edges, you know, could be one of the models of those beautiful drawings in your nave. This too could be any piece of contemporary architecture, right? You've seen images like this. These are the next hierarchical level. These are all those components beginning to be organized into discrete subsidiary systems. This is the genitals of a dust mite, for those of you who really want to know. But actually it's a hierarchical assembly of simple components that I'm interested in. And there are a number of systems that we can, when we understand them, that we can put to use computationally for design and also to help us understand how the world got to be the way it is today. This is Arthropoda, the largest class. What they originate from is the most simple organism, a tube worm. It's a mouth, an anus, tube of flesh, nothing much else. And yet, if we look at the systems, it produces all these great variations of form. And I want to talk a little bit how it does that. Well, that's kind of a long piece of science in biology. Starts around 1850. There's nothing comparative in the study of cities. You're talking tens of thousands of people. The best brains for 8 generations have been studying biology. There isn't a comparable depth of study in architecture, and particularly not in cities. About 15 years ago, big change in biology. And like in architecture, biology had its kind of separate groups who didn't really talk to each other. The embryologists, that's the guys who study how a tree or a human or a mammal grows from a single cell to a full adult. And the evolutionists who look at the changes over multiple generations. And those of you interested, the slang term is Evo-Devo. And what it does is relate the body plan and the genetics to both evolution and development. Most computational models in architecture and in computer science are still based on a kind of 1950s understanding of Darwinian logic. This has not yet fed through to computational systems. And what it tells us is that you can make a great variation of form, almost every variation, by simply changing the number of repetitions of the modules, changing their size, their shape. For us, that means a section. And you can see pretty clearly there, and much more clearly here. So if we have any doubts about our origin, we can see the structural system, the components in the array. The only difference is the tail. And pretty much it seems to be true. This is a very old drawing, forgive the resolution, of almost every living thing. So underlying every living thing are these very common organizational principles. And the variations of form and how we get to them are what we're interested in. We also see the same thing in the information system. Information system of DNA has only 4 components, really super simple. But it's the sequence that's significant. And most of you will be familiar with these kind of things, like a zipper, how one side is transferred to the other. There's no correlation in the genome, the amount of information in terms of the size of the organism. This is quite shocking for architects, because we kind of got used to the idea that a big building has a whole lot of drawings and data stuff, and little pavilions have a tiny amount. This doesn't seem to be true. And particularly if we look at the bottom here, you can see about the amoeba. So there's a lot of redundancy in the information system. But the really big surprise when it was first decoded was actually how small it is for what it does. And I'm going to be looking a little bit at the structure of that. So all that stuff, all that DNA stuff is packed up into the chromosomes, the X and Ys. And just for, you can see, you'll know about the X and the Y, that the men are kind of missing on the 23rd pair. They're kind of missing one leg. And that codes for intelligence. So it is true that women are smarter. There's something really cool and interesting about the structure of that information, how it works. And there's this little kind of set of instructions called a homeobox. What the homeobox does is turn other genes on and off. So if you can think of it as kind of software instructions, like you're in Rhino, and it's turning on these two, and telling those two to wait, and these two to go faster, and those to slow down. So there's a little subset. So you have huge instruction set, all kinds of proteins. But the whole thing is controlled by a really, really small subset that's just turning on and off the others. And that subset, homeobox, is common to all living things. It's not identical, but it's pretty much the same. And the way we understand it is it's mapped to a body plan. Now, a body plan is not like the way we think of a body plan. It's just kind of basic organization. There's a head, there's limbs, there's a front and a back, kind of organs and stuff. But pretty much we'll see the homeobox, even though it's really small, can produce real complexity. So this is a big lesson for computation. You don't need to have very amazing instructions. In fact, the simpler they are, the better. Copy, paste, rotate, uniform scale, all that stuff we're used to. The simpler it is, the better. The smartness comes in how these are related. There's a couple of other things we need to understand. So, if you want to change the chicken to a snake, I don't know why you would, but if you do, you kind of get the idea how you might like to do that. Okay? So we're just talking about this kind of repetition. We can change the section of the ribs a little bit. basic organization, a body plan, is the way it produces that. But everything else is pretty much the same. So you don't even need very complex body plans. Okay, so this is kind of diagram. It's in the book if you want to go further with it. There's a couple of other things that are happening while this is going on. And one is mutation. Mutation starts, you can think of this, there's only 4 kinds I'm going to show you, but mostly it's a kind of copy error. As one side of the helix is copied to the other. Anyone who's put their zip together on a cold day on their coat knows you can get this wrong. There's other kinds of experiences you will have had, all of you, with this, so you know, we've all had that experience. Okay. This becomes really significant. And those of you who are kind of into scripting and coding know, or should know, and if you study these become really powerful techniques. This is how you produce mutation, by altering the sequence, by leaving stuff out. A duplication, inversion, and insertion. That's it. You don't need to do more than that. 4 techniques. All living things have done that. And you can see immediately, if you think of each one of those as an instruction, how significant the difference is. This is the first ever genetic experiment. This is the first, I don't even know what to call it, if it's a translocation. It's not really a proper one. These are brutal days in the early days of genetic experiments, and they're really just hacking at the genome. It's like a guy in the workshop late at night with a kind of blunt saw. You can't fix something and getting angry. But it's the first one. Very famous for biologists, is producing the forks. Now, they're able to translocate, change whole bits of an object. These are, where the antennae should be, are legs. In one sense, those are fully functional. Of course, they're not hardwired into the brain, and the fly doesn't know how to stand on its head. So in that sense, behaviorally, they're not functional. But mechanically, they are. Even more scary, antennae are being replaced by eyes. Again, not hardwired. However, what's beginning to become clear is that you can move and translocate whole pieces of a gene. In terms of informational systems, what's also clear from biology is that earlier you do it in the development, the more profound the effects. The later you do it, the less significant. So ethnical differences between humans, for example, are the last tiny bit. They're almost insignificant. In biological and genetic terms, ethnicity is not a concept. It's just so far down the kind of chain of development, they're very, very tiny adaptations, which I'll talk about in a bit. Most mutations don't last. They're deleterious. Natural ones. This is a white peacock, a male. He's not going to attract any females because he hasn't got the most colors. So his children, he's not going to have children, and that gene, damaged gene, a mutated gene, is not going to propagate. That's the Darwinian theory. It's beginning to be changed, and actually on rereading of Darwin, we realize he did say that selection acts on the individual, but he also said it acts on populations. And how it acts on the populations is through metabolism. And in my argument, this is where cultural evolution and human evolution and the evolution of all living things share a mechanism of development and adaptation. So, if you think about our metabolism, we all know about trees and stuff, we pack an awful lot of surfaces inside us. And we have to do the same job as the tree. Every cell has to be fueled. and its wastes have to be collected and distributed and got rid of. Most living things, apart from humans, have adapted their metabolism has helped them adapt their form to be suited to the behavior of their environment. This cactus can, as it stores water, the kind of natural folds can open, it can get fatter, it's got protective spines. You move this to Finland, it's going to die immediately. It can only exist in this particular climate. Similar mechanism, storing water. Again, move it to cold weather climates, it can't adapt. Organisms that have to restrict the amount of water they evaporate for one reason or another also have these kind of adaptations. And you're very familiar with these kind of colors. Color also is an adaptation of living things. Something else comes out of metabolism, and this is where it's very important that we begin to understand, particularly for the analysis of our cities and for the design of new cities. It's the pattern of distribution. How many big ones, the relationship of how smaller and medium size and different sizes and different species relate to each other. We do not have this concept in cities. I'm going to show what we do have, but we don't have anything more than the most simple speciation. And certainly, we're not yet really using the mathematics of this. The maths of this has been intensively studied by biologists. And biologists, it's all published. The amazing thing about science is opposite to architecture. When I went to architecture school, we used to draw like that. And when it came to the big crit day, you'd arrive and put your drawings up, but you'd never explain how you did it. You'd just kind of say, yeah, that was easy. And of course, you've been killing yourself for 3 days and nights, but you pretended it was, not too difficult. Okay. So metabolism, an ancient word for the fire of life. It has some really interesting math. It seems to apply from the smallest microbe through to the blue whale. It seems to apply to patterns of distribution of ecosystems, and increasingly research is beginning to show it applies, although somewhat badly, to human artifacts in the city. The bad part is it complies to the diagram, and the physical infrastructures of the city, of course, are pretty ropey, in disrepair, not incredibly well designed. Okay. So, a little bit of maths, those of you who like that. Living things, slow ones and fast ones, get through the same amount of energy in their lifespan. And it always scales to the body mass. That's called a power law. They're really useful, simple to understand. That's where it becomes kind of quite freaky the first time you kind of get that. That's why this thing lives super fast. It's eating and shitting all the time. It hasn't really got time to do anything else. A bit of breathing, when it's got a spare minute, that has to go pretty fast too. Right? This thing has memory, has culture, has very large territories, extended families, and social order. And that comes with the pace of life, with its metabolism. But just down the road from here, is Santa Fe just down the road? For me it is, I guess. It's sort of, this part of the world, right? Santa Fe Institute of Complexity Studies, really, really interesting place. West Brown Enquist. There's some simpler books if you find their papers too kind of too obtuse. There's a very nice book called, I think it's called In a Heartbeat. And I can give the reference. afterwards it kind of explains it really well. But these are the guys who've been mapping and analyzing all biological systems for these power cords. And recently, with the help of a guy called Betancourt, they've been studying cities. Now, they don't study cities in the way we do. They don't look at the forms, the morphology, the spatial organization. They don't look at the body plan. What they have been looking at is the pace of life. How many patents, or is the crime rate, those kind of indicators. And they say those things do correspond. Cities are mathematically like living organisms. Now for me, that's kind of a big insight. It's a long time been a metaphor in architecture. But here you have kind of hardcore science, Santa Fe. You don't get more serious than the Santa Fe Institute, saying, yes, cities are, in many aspects, just like living systems. We have some kind of fundamental misunderstandings about the relation of form and environment. And as I'm talking, you can kind of look over that. We are the only species that adapts environment to suit us. Everything else has adapted its form to suit the environment. These kind of things are what in Europe are kind of current theology of sustainability. Sustainability is not going to work. I'll explain that later why. Yeah. But one of the reasons is they get mixed up between endotherms and ectotherms. Social order. Well, this is not one organism. This form is each individual organisms. Probably clearer in that. Each one of these is an individual. They group together to make that form for metabolic reasons. They can process more water through them, capture more food. They can kind of share it. And this is a very common arrangement. Some of them are really beautiful, we're more familiar with, but they're amazingly precise. This can regulate its internal temperature to 0.5 degree, better than this system you have in this room. They can regulate gases, the proportion of carbon dioxide and oxygen. They can regulate humidity. And no single individual needs to know how to do it. Most of these things have very few neurons. So there's a special kind of mathematics the biologists have been looking at. How do they do that? And for us, that's really interesting because it gives us a model of intelligence. Those of you, like Andrew and Jason in their work looking at kind of component systems and how you distribute those, each thing that you distribute, each component, does not have to be super intelligent. Intelligent behavior comes from the relation of the components to each other. These are called magnetic termites, not because they are magnetic, of course, because they're aligned east to west. And social insects don't have a hierarchy. There's no boss. You know, Isla's not there, and neither am I. Nobody in charge. There's no plan. There's just these things, millions of them, and they interact with each other. And out of that interaction comes this super intelligent behavior. And they have a spatial organization. They're going to talk about humans, and then I'll go to where we are. So most of us will be familiar with this root. Many animals have a culture. And the reason why we're this shape is called expensive tissue hypothesis. The brain uses 22 times as much energy as any other part of your body. So humans are very, very efficient killers. That's why we're this shape, that we can kill other things, package a lot of food energy into a small volume. And we've done it kind of wastefully, and I'm going to show you some things. This shape, by the way, this human shape, is arguably 120,000 years only, which for in biology is kind of super new, from one small population in Ethiopia. I'll come to, and possibly from one woman, but I'll explain that in a minute. Apes also have a social organization and a territory. They're not random wandering. They have a kind of seasonal pattern, they have deep ecological knowledge of their territory, and they have very strong kind of social rules. Most of those rules humans still have. The number of people you know by face is pretty much the same as an ape. You can know the face and name of somewhere between 80 to 160 people, depending on how good your memory is. That's pretty much the same for an ape. And they have a kind of modest hierarchy. They always have a leader of some kind. Like us, they often elect their leader and then kill them. Okay, so we have this kind of special other stuff that's going alongside the DNA systems, our cultural information system. So we have two streams of information. That's why we've evolved so fast, and why we come to, well, I'll show you what we've done in a minute. And pretty much this package, archaeologists and biologists argue a little bit about this, but it's somewhere around 35,000 years old. Not very long ago. There is an argument for certain biologists who look at the mitochondria. That's the bit inside every human cell that processes the energy. That all humans are descended from one woman in this population. Mitochondria passes down through the female line. And this is what's called a consensual map. I've drawn this as a way of kind of pulling together lots of different things. It contains the least amount of argument until we get to here. And this bit, the Americans don't like very much. Because, you know, all this other stuff is a lot older. So they've invented these Clovis people. You heard about this? Okay, American archaeologists say they're Clovis people who pre-exist the passage of humans down through there. And the other argument is, well, of course, you can't fill up a whole continent in 1,000 years, but actually when you do the math, yes, you can. Because around about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, the world was full. Hunter-gatherer societies, properly we would say hunter-gatherer fishing. We're not random wanderers, of course, but it takes a lot of territory. And humans, like other species, have always evolved to their maximum numbers that their system, the energetic system, the metabolic system will support. 6,000 years ago, the world was full. And it's estimated that's about 1 million people only. Okay. Around about 10 to 15,000 years ago, architecture was pretty widespread. Arguably that too came with a culture. It's not certain how old pit structures are, and there's some argument, but generally the earliest examples that have been found are about 15,000 years. There's some argument that maybe it's 20, but generally most scientists would accept 15,000 years. You were digging holes and building, this is from a nice Japanese study, but pretty much I think that's kind of slightly romantic drawing. The morphological set is more interesting. And we can still find the remains of it. And they're not randomly distributed. Like apes, when apes make their nests, they seem to be in a kind of cluster. There seem to be these kind of spaces that emerge in between them. We might say somehow these kind of formations are the beginning of the space of the city. There's certainly a kind of social space. This is from the Ukraine 15,000 years ago. Now, every continent disputes the idea that it was only humans who killed off all the megafauna. Nonetheless, everywhere we find these lovely component systems to build these houses, and of course these are the bones of the megafauna. And we can still find, if we take aerial photographs, some of these kind of remains. And in the book I argue there's two principal kinds. The kind of latest stage, the evolution of those when they start to join the pit structures together, and we get the longhouses. This is a reconstruction, of course, Viking longhouse. And some parts of the world, they still build variations of them. They're very beautiful, I think. And they have a kind of social order. About the same time, 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, we had arguably written language. And we can trace the evolution of writing in the same way we can with other things. So these are pictures initially. They look like the thing they're describing. Woman, mountain. You can see fairly common bowl, and gradually they become abstract symbols. The amount of things you can say increases exponentially when you have abstract symbols. It's really hard to think of something you don't have a word for. If you can make new words from symbols, and you can expand the kinds of things you can talk and think about. Okay. And this comes around about the same time that humans are combining these two spatial orders. So this is what I call a founding system. This is a hunter-gatherer system. It was always networked. Apes had networks, by the way. They, on the boundaries of their territory, they exchanged females, young males go to the boundary and so forth. But there's very strong archaeological evidence for this. So hunter-gatherers were not random warriors. They had fixed territories. They moved around different times of the year within their territory, and they traded. It's a network. So, 6,000 years ago, maximum numbers, maximize in terms also the complexity of information they could handle. And climate begins to change. In the space of 1,000 years, there are 3 major droughts, each one lasting between 200 and 400 years. Very severe, just like you're having here now. So you know you're all doomed, don't you, in California? I don't know whether it's the earthquake, the lack of water, or running out of energy. Your economy is going to get you first. So what happens when a system collapses? Well, this is true of all complex systems. There's only 3 outcomes. Dispersal doesn't necessarily mean everyone dies. Generally, the old folks will stay where they are. They're not going to move. The younger ones will move. Within 3 or 4 generations. What happened there was in a very spread out human system, spread out all over the world. As the climate began to dry, the rain bands moved, plants died off, animals migrated, and humans had to follow. And they went to the river valleys. It's the only places that were left that had a kind of thought ecology. Simplification, well, by another means, that's sustainability. I'll tell you about, there's only one example in human history of that. And mostly what I'm talking about and advocating is higher complexity. And that's always associated with a greater flow of energy and of information. So there we go. Not possible in 1,000 years for all of these places to communicate with each other. It's not, as I was taught when I was young, that cities kind of started on the edge of the Mediterranean and everybody learned how to make one. And, you know, that's kind of Western model of civilization. You've all heard that story, right? Yeah. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Rome, 1,000 years of darkness, Renaissance, Northern Europe, America. That's kind of standard orthodox story, and it's completely untrue. It's actually rubbish. Okay. So, across the world, cities emerge through this kind of densification, nucleation. A lot of people going to the same place. So the topological patterns, these network patterns, became denser and denser, always in the river valleys. And what came with it, of course, there starts to be an axiom of network theory, things that are already well connected get more connections. This seems to be true of the internet, railway lines, all the way back in history. At this point, it's true. Okay, and pretty much, of course it's a modern photograph, all cities emerge like this. Close to the river, a little bit of agriculture, fairly simple clustering of building, what we would call probably a municipal authority would say is a large town. There are several that claim they're the oldest city in the world. Jericho claims it is. Probably you're talking 2,000 to 5,000 people, and always in the river valleys. Most recently discovered in Peru, Corral. Only discovered about 15 years ago, still being excavated. So there's one. Ancient first city. Arguably, as far as I know in my research, this is the oldest. It's defended, has a very simple organization of very simple buildings. There it is today, and still there. And it's, you know, many parts of the world, these things can still be seen and still exist. And in the book, I trace the kind of evolutionary model. But the point I want to make just simply tonight is that social orders evolve with the form of the city, not the other way around. It's not like you get a great society and it's got these rules and certain kinds of behavior, and then they all go out and say, let's go and make a city. Things grow together. This is what nowadays might be called the Islamic city. It has, you know, in terms of analysis, degrees of privacy from the main street through the courtyards to the houses, and within the house that's repeated. So it has this kind of fractal organization, self-similarity that's exhibited by many biological systems. And in a higher order of complexity, of course, they're chained into very increasingly larger and larger organizations. The Nile, normally the way I was taught, this is the largest, the Roman one. I didn't find out until, you know, I was middle-aged, that the Han Chinese Empire was the same size as the Roman Empire. It existed at the same time, 60 million people. And the Chinese Empire had printing, admittedly wood blocks that had to be hand carved, so it's not mechanized printing. They had a fantastic information system. And it was an egalitarian society in that anybody who was intelligent could be promoted through the Mandarin system. So, when the collapse of these two systems came, the Han Chinese and the Roman, they both collapsed at the same time. Rome, the western part of the world, Europe is now full of tiny little fractured countries. China was one country, recovered very quickly. In the book, of course, I also trace this kind of evolution of the longhouse, repeated in the kind of plan of the city, body plan, if you will. And we can still see evidence of it today. Most human information systems, the argument The first ones that we find are counting phases of the moon. The cave paintings, which have been always taught as religious icons, but were actually data sets of where to find and how to kill large mammals, confirmed by the findings of bones very close to them. And the other thing is taxes and derivatives. These are the same thing that has caused the last two big recessions. Yeah? These are derivatives. These are me promising you, I will give you in 3 months' time the product of my field if you give me your gold now. And I can sell that to him, and I can make another transaction. This is Mesopotamia. There are tens of thousands of these. But you can also see the evolution from the ground thing that is still looking like the thing it's symbolizing to the abstract systems. Okay. This, in my research, as far as I can find, is the oldest plan. About 4,000 years old. Now, some argue, I've never been told by an architectural historian. They always told me, well, you know, the Egyptians, maybe they had plans, maybe they didn't. Pretty much the plan was supposedly a Greek invention, and the Romans kind of, right, this is Mesopotamia, Babylon. And the thing around his skirt is a kind of mad poem about how to build that. It's a specification, but it also has the kind of poetry that, you know, architects still aspire to. It's slightly insane, you know, it's kind of very, very repetitive and got some things about the phases of the moon and kind of not a lot of it, what we would think of irrelevant stuff, but it's a kind of poetry, and there's the plan. Okay. So I'm going to miss out 2,000 years, or 4,000 actually, and because there isn't time for what I want to talk about. Some of it's in the book, some of it's in the new book, and I have some new publications coming out next year. I want to talk a little bit about where we are. Okay. And especially for the students, I want to talk about this sentence. Each generation will have to build its own city. It's a project of the imagination. And it's fallen a lot out of architectural discourse. It's beginning to be very happy to see here, little beginnings, and in other schools around the world, it's beginning to reappear. But it used to be a great dream of architects. It was manifested in the city. And there's been, in the last 100 years, ideal cities of various kinds, and there's always been a certain kind of anxiety, sometimes very strongly expressed, sometimes repressed, that goes with the future city. And it has two principal components: the metropolis, the superblock, and the tower. I'm going to show you some really scary drawings. 1924, Hilbersheimer. Americans say this is a socialist project. Actually, when Hilbersheimer came to America, he did some very nice work in Chicago, and instead of going that way, he kind of went that way. Same kind of dream of the city, but we'll come to that. But these are huge blocks. Okay? It's a dream of a city for 1 million people. And the plan's really simple. Quite German, some would say. You know, I was born in Germany, so I can say that. No social space, really. There's this kind of platform where, I mean, I love what's in the drawings, you know, there's like 12 people inhabit this city. And this is Russia down here. But this is kind of elevated level, which is where people are. And this is all residential, this is commercial, industrial, and kind of traffic systems, the arterial systems are below. And actually, I think you can see, it's kind of super simple explains it all. Okay, 600 meters long. A little bit later, Corbusier, that's around about the same time. Corbusier, even more scary in a way. Contemporary city. Corb wants to outdo everybody. If Simon's doing 1 million, I'm going to do 3. However, what is scary about this, and is very rarely talked about with Corbusier, at least the way I was taught for my generation, these are for the rich and the elite. And you and I would be out here, so I'd be right up here. You go kind of at you because you're still useful. You know, you'd be sort of on these edges here. Okay? But these are also 60 stories high. Yeah. And this lovely thing we kind of laugh at nowadays, but you know, there's a nice kind of flow system and the airport's in the middle. You know. That's kind of funny in a way. But the car is beginning to appear. It's in the plans. It's still kind of, you know, not yet every man has his car. Plan Voisin, of course, named after a car because they funded it. Okay, fast forward, 1930. Of course, here we have the vision of the metropolis, and pretty much it's the same today. Multi-layered, huge amounts of flow, traffic system, great soaring towers, light, the kind of programmatic hierarchies. And of course this was done by out-of-work architects, built them all, of course. No real projects in the 30s. But you know, with if you look at the stuff outside, put this grasshopper a little kind of more curvy. If it was an Andrew studio, it's got to have a little more of this and that. But pretty much we're still doing this. This is 1930. This is from a film, just imagine. Most of you know this. Metropolis film. There's lots of stuff about it. It's not actually a very good film. I wouldn't recommend necessarily seeing it. It's just but the models were amazingly interesting. There's one other thing that's interesting. Is this is really also about the dystopian anxiety. Society, if you know, this is a war. The film's about a war between the workers and the elite. And the head of the elite is a mad scientist, architect. And it's amazing throughout the rest of the century how this kind of strange, how the public think about art. Because very often it's the architect who's the last resident and the organizer of this society. Okay. A less famous film, but in a way, perhaps more, you know, you start to recognize some of their buildings and the themes.
Is it any better world than it used to be? I rebel against this progress. What has this progress, this world civilization done to us? Machines and marvels. They've built these great cities of theirs, yes. They've prolonged life, yes. They've conquered nature, they say, and made a great white world. Is it any jollier than the world used to be in the good old days, when life was short and hot and merry and the devil took the hindmost? All the same, what can we do about it?
Okay. That could be my mum doesn't look like that, but she'd pretty much agree with all of that. Okay, so the metropolis has this kind of, it's a promise of the future, it's a dream of architects. But there's another one that runs alongside it that starts more or less about the same time, which is the garden city, which instead of this kind of dense concentration of verticality is about endless extension. And there's a social logic that goes with it. Broadacre, I don't know if Frank Lloyd Wright's history very much, but I'm quite sure he's never did much farming. But every family had 1 acre. And he also imagined The person who ran, he recommended, to run Broadacre City should be an architect. Right? So, but pretty much we can see the same logic at work. What organizes this is the distribution system, the transport system. It's an agrarian society. Everybody has to do a bit of farming, and we'll see the consequences of that in a minute. And it would extend endlessly, although he made one kind of famous model, and the first drawings were about 10-acre plot, 10 square miles. Principally, these are citizens who own land, and this could extend from one coast of the US to the other. Hilbert-Seymour makes it more formal, 1944. He's an American citizen by then. And we can see this kind of gridded organization. There's a few blocks in the middle of it, and a similar logic is beginning to appear. Lots and lots of little houses, some linear blocks organized around the main transportation system. And again, capable of endless extension. Role of the architect now.
It's my duty as your dean to say you will never become an architect.
I am an architect.
Okay. That's the whole story of the Fountainhead. It takes an hour and a half. There's a lot of kind of social stuff in it. But it romanticizes the role of the architect. By now, that's a kind of the architect's a cultural player. Famously, he designs his building, and the owners kind of compromise the design, and he sneaks out in the middle of the night and blows it up. His design, his authorship is more important than the building and its owners and what they want to do. And that becomes kind of institutionalized in culture around about 1940, 1943. There are many other books that do that. So architects had this during the century, mad scientist, bad guy, protagonist role, and romantic dream of the individual as an artist. Pretty much this is where we are. I want to talk a little bit around about 1970, where in the Garden City, different kind of things starts to happen. The Garden City starts being utopian dream. This is fantastic. One of my favorite pieces of literature, a beautiful short story by J.G. Ballard. It's called The Ultimate City. And in the story, the Garden City has been built. It's all windmills and solar panels and bicycle clips. And there's a young man in it, Holloway, of course, who hates it. And he dreams of going to the nearby abandoned metropolis. This is the built agrarian society. Everything is kind of mild. They're all vegetarians. Everything is great. And he hates it. And this is what he dreams about. And of course, it's Ballard, so he's obsessed with flying. And there's his glider. And in the book, he starts to have this dream of reoccupying or reanimate, bringing to life somehow this city. And what he wants to do, with the help of a mute called Olds, who can fix anything, he managed to reconnect some of the power systems. And he turns on all the TVs and the toasters and all the neon. And it's full of light and noise. And that's exciting. And that's what he misses. It's only now in this raucous light and noise the city was being its true self. And the flood of cheap neon was really alive. Of course, it all goes horribly wrong for him. But the dream was to reanimate. The city was abandoned. And the dream was then to reanimate. Andrew's studio, we know. It's the ending of many of you starting to re-examine what has actually been built for the towns. This is Hong Kong. Many of my students at MTech come from China and Hong Kong. They're your age, they're mid to late 20s. They've grown up in 60-story tower blocks with no social provision. Just a kind of relentless stack of increasingly smaller and smaller apartments. Environmentally, they're packed really close. These are the original drawings from the 70s, late 70s. You can see the typology very clearly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The apartments are there, and you just stack them up. 60 stories plus, and there they are. That's what's built. We're not talking about Dubai and the kind of bankers' palaces where great architectural effort has been invested. Most towers that are built are like this in the world. Just down the road, 085. This is Broadacre. This is what it's become. You can find this anywhere in the US. And increasingly in South America, to quarter-acre plots, I think it's and they're getting smaller. This one we've seen. And there's a kind of insanity to the amount of physical material that's used to produce the distribution system that we use. An unmanageable complexity. And in large parts of the world, where the rich live in towers, huge numbers of people live like this. You don't see that here, but for most of the world outside of the US, South America, India, China, very large parts of the world you will see this. And but for the accident of our birth, our station in life, we'd be out here, or maybe a little closer. And every meter of the Earth's surface has been changed by humans. Every meter. Some like this, very beautifully engineered. These are rice fields, rice paddies. Fantastic engineering. And we have manufactured the landscapes of the world. And we forget everything comes from somewhere else. These nice little things here, because you don't see it being produced, in our clothes and our computers, our cars, the elements of the building. Whole landscapes like this are used to produce them. And human systems, arguably, are at their maximum complexity. Nobody's quite sure about that. In terms of the physical world, these are the uncontested ecological systems that are on the threshold of change. Some already beginning to transit through them. Simplification is only one known example in the whole of human history. And that's the eastern half of the Roman Empire, when that began to collapse. Collapsed for the same reason, climate change, freezing parts of the northern world, drove the Han and the Mongol tribes further south. Endlessly extended, huge amounts of shipping of food, increasing numbers of people engaged in processing and originating information. The eastern half had a kind of sustainability function. What they decided to do was to give up territory, to give up money, to give up, to take their taxation in kind, in sheep and wheat and so forth, rather than money, to disband their armies, to disband their civil service. And they shrank and shrank and shrank their territory from 30 million down to one city, Constantinople, Istanbul today. My argument is that this is what we should be looking at. We should be thinking about the reordering of cities. If we get it wrong, this is one of the destinies. This was a city on the Silk Road. Better connected than San Francisco. San Francisco is way out on a kind of terminal point. Okay? This is actually on the Silk Road, on a major route from China down to Venice and then up in Europe. They cut down all their trees, used them for fuel. They diverted the river. When the monsoon shifted and the big droughts came, this is what became of them. Increasingly in our films and literature, the abandoned city is the most powerful image. This is from I Am Legion. It's often Manhattan, but there are real ones. Detroit, parts of Chicago. In Detroit, they're starting to demolish some suburban areas. Don't know what to do with them, can't sustain them. It's more economical to demolish them and turn them into grassland than to maintain them. Berlin, in Europe, has 2/3 the number of people the city was built for. Europe, nobody's having children in Europe. Probably all heard about Italy, but pretty much that's now become a European-wide phenomenon. This is a real one too. This is near Chernobyl. Some of you will know about this.
Revelation that I've had during my time here. It came to me when I tried to classify your species, and I realized that you're not actually mammals. Every mammal on this planet instinctively develops a natural equilibrium with the surrounding environment, but you humans do not. You move to an area and you multiply, and multiply until every natural resource is consumed. And the only way you can survive is to spread to another area. There is another organism on this planet that follows the same pattern. Do you know what it is? A virus. Human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. You are a plague, and we are the cure.
And of course, he is, pure information. So this is what we're talking about. What contribution can we make? Well, for your generation, the UN is right. There's going to be another 2 billion people in your lifetime. And that kind of more or less works out. 2,000 new cities, 1 million inhabitants, and they're being built now, without many architects involved, if any. Okay. So we're back to this. Increasingly, our dreams of the city are mixed with these kind of anxieties about the loss of identity that comes with great numbers of people. And the old dreams of the metropolis and the garden city, of the tower and the super block are worn out. They don't work. They're done. There's 100 years of them and they're crap. And nobody really wants them. But we don't have new concepts. Outside of architecture, dreams of cities, this is from the neutron, are increasingly virtual. Worlds without physicality. And your job, and mine, is to bring a physicality to that. Well, that's what I'm doing. That's what everyone needs to do. I want to work on the science of cities. This phrase, urban metabolism, is 50 years old. About 12 people have worked on that in 50 years. In biology, that's tens of thousands, I think. Okay. And the work I'm engaged in is transferring the maths and the logics of branching networks and surfaces. As I said, we pack a lot of surfaces. Everything we have inside us is very convoluted things. And there is kind of physics that comes where we can re-examine these things and we can look at the branching logics. It's not to do with the geometry. It's not the physical pattern, but it's the topology, the connections, how they're connected, how many connections and what is connected to what. And we can think of the city as a kind of very, very convoluted surface. And again, traditional studies of urban morphology, although they're kind of super interesting, are largely plan organizations. And we need to be looking at the physics of environmental behaviors of these rough and convoluted surfaces. And there is a whole set of mathematics that we're looking at. Sorry about the contrast there. That comes from urban climatology. A whole new discipline. Nothing to do with architects. They've been working on this for about 15 years. Recently started to publish because they have both measured field observations and mathematical theories which match. So it's a known math. That means we can design these things and run these equations and test them, and provided we've got a data set to compare it with, we can look at how our designs correspond to them. We can also, this is done in Rhino by the way, which makes space syntax highly redundant. So we can take techniques of topological connection in cities, and we can extend it from the most private room through the hierarchy all the way to the public spaces, and from the public spaces to the street network. Okay. And when we do that, of course, it brings together all of these kind of physics with the mathematics of networks. So that's the kind of area of research I'm engaged in with some of my doctoral and master's students. But a broader endeavor. This is the Ramblas, arguably one of the best urban spaces on Earth. The reason why it's always full, people go there because they like to be there. We don't really have so many spaces in cities like that. This is Raymond, Lower Manhattan Expressway. Somebody who's good at history, this is the late 60s, isn't it? I forget. Maybe early 70s. Probably early 70s, but there's the car, tiny train, lots of space for cars. But the general idea from the metabolists was that you design a city and you think about a city like an organism that has a series of things that have different time scales. And that the distribution system can be inhabited and can be socialized. And we need to somehow bring these two together. So I want to invite you to suggest to your generation that we need to reanimate the dream of the city. That somewhere there still is a utopian dream of a city that belongs properly with your generation. But we need to make it egalitarian. Not gilded palaces for bankers, but for people. We need to incorporate public spaces. We need to incorporate our agriculture. We need to think of the surface of the earth we have already affected. We need to design it more consciously, more completely. I think in US there's this phrase about rewilding. That's a kind of conscious design effort. It's more working in Canada more strongly. We need to incorporate our best intelligence and our most advanced system doing this. There's no hair-shirt sustainability that's going to work. We have to invest our best technologies and our best inventions in these landscapes. And we have to, what I would call, have augmented, instrumented landscapes. We need to understand every weather change, how things grow. We need to understand and model it all. And if we can do all that, we can make something that we might call ecologically intelligent meta-systems that link all these things together. One day, we come back to the question that I think has been not in architecture, but in cultural endeavors, in literature and in film, always the principal subtext for the last 100 years. Does the city serve us, or do we serve the city? Thank you. If you want to know more about the maths, I'm going to talk about that, and the physics, I'm going to talk about that on Wednesday at Berkeley.
Here we go. So are you suggesting that we actually practice permaculture?
Sorry?
So are you suggesting that we actually practice permaculture, where it's the act of following nature how to actually create our spaces?
I think what we're talking about is, in computational terms, is nature 2. It's like a software version. We have already changed it, irretrievably, irrecoverably. From the first hunter-gatherers who picked grains, they altered, by repeating over many generations, the genetic code of the grain. So we need to do it more deliberately. We don't need to be shy about it. We should do it better. We should design everything. We should design the world's landscapes. Yes. Something more than following nature.
I wonder what you think of the Highline project in New York as a kind of example of redesigning, sort of rewilding a space that's kind of technologically defunct.
I don't know very well. Let me tell you what I do know. In Europe, for a long time, there's been kind of questions about what they call invasive species. Canada, I think, about 10 years ago, abandoned that notion. So any, in the Canadian forests, any species that will flourish in the climate is fine. There's no concept of a species that belongs to one place and you can't do something. I don't know that particular. I don't mean that we're going to flood the world with, you know, mammoths and stuff like that. But I think we do need to be much, much more aware of the ecological world, of what we've done. And I don't take any kind of moral position about it. I'm not saying we're all bad guys and we need to stop messing around with it. The opposite. I'm saying we need to do it a lot better. So any kind of rewilding of deliberate design of so-called natural ecology, I think is good. Provided the science is good and it works, yes, we should do it. We should do more.
I mention it because I think it would be interesting for your line of research. It sort of is a kind of corollary to the Ramblas in Barcelona.
I'd like to look at it.
Sorry, go ahead.
We have two systems we're looking at, and we're supposed to find the dream of a city between them, the utopian, dystopian, and we have metabolism. But both examples are so anti-egalitarian. Where are you supposed to find a
Well, I don't know what metabolism is, because if we think about metabolism in a pure biological sense, every cell, no matter where it is and what kind it is, has the same kind of distribution as every other. So I do think
they both use circulation, but most parts deserve or create more energy than other things. There's ports that are less used and less paid attention to, or rather they get less energy instead of asking for just as much, and there's just as many cells, they still get less response than the high level places.
I'm not quite sure I accept the point that you're making that.
I wish we had another choice of egalitarianism to look at. Other than metabolism, it feels like everything we're looking at.
I'm not saying that's. I'm saying that's my job, and for people like me, that's my. I'm not saying I put the others forward. There's different kinds of work that need to go on at the same time, and they need to be integrated. I'm not saying every architect in the world has to understand the power scaling and the physics of metabolism. I am saying that it is, designing a city is not about bankers' palaces and stacking up things. It is about social spaces. And the social spaces need to be integrated in a way that's kind of beautiful and habitable, enjoyable, at the same time incredibly efficient metabolically. I don't see those as incompatible. As far as I know, infrastructural systems are never ever discussed, at least in Europe, in the same way and by the same people as social spaces, ever. Road engineers and so forth, it's nothing to do with that. I am saying these have to be integrated.
You mentioned that you thought that the urban, the super block and the tower block were dead and over. And I wonder what you think about if the urban block, like San Francisco's urban block, say, could be a model for future cities, if not those two.
Well, I think density is a problem. I do know, I think there are people looking at urban blocks on the scale for China, very large growing populations. You don't have a growing population. You have a lot of immigrants, but you don't have a growing population. They're looking at similar sized blocks that incorporate, to some extent, some agrarian systems. I mean, I love San Francisco. I love being here, but I think you're good. I hope it's still here in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I think it's just a great place to be. I can't see it as a world model.
Project networks are inherently hierarchical, so if you follow that, you're going to end up with a hierarchical city. It's that what you want, though.
All systems are hierarchical in the physical world and in nature. It doesn't mean that they have to be oppressive social hierarchies. It doesn't mean we have to have dictators. At least I don't think so. My argument is not. Social insects manage these kind of great engineering enterprises. Bees, of course, do have the queen. The queen is kind of imprisoned in the basement, just doing big stuff. No, I am optimistic. I do think humans can make a better future. But I think it has to be a deliberate engagement, and we have to make our best efforts. And I am scared and worried about the consequences if we don't.
First of all, fantastic talk. Thank you very much. Your point that social orders evolve with the form of the city and not the other way around suggests that the point of intervention should be the form of the city, not social orders, politics, law, that sort of thing. So,
yeah, I don't know how we persuade them, but in my view, the politicians are the bad guys.
Well, so
I don't know how we persuade them, and again, that's another project in a way for the act of persuasion and the compelling dream. Sorry.
Well, the question I have is, what then are the most promising levers or sites of intervention, given that the form of cities is actually relatively brittle and hard to change? I mean, an aerial photo of Rome looks a lot like it did 2,000 years ago.
You could say there are two principal different things to do. There's work to be done on the mature cities that exist, and there are the new cities. And then there are, one of the consequences of climate change is, if we stop thinking about it as being bad or good news, is that new territories are emerging with new biomes. So, for example, the melting tundra is going to be outgassing methane for 200 to 300 years, and obviously you could farm that, you could have because it's going to be very soggy, you could have very distributed, lightweight cities that are kind of methane farming, harvesting, and sitting on the ground very lightly. So I think it's also possible to imagine those sea level rises that you have, most of the mature cities, including San Francisco, where you have these nice hilly bits, but you also have these flat bits of made up land, which is going to get super saturated pretty quickly. But most of the mega cities of the world are on delta. They're going to be inundated. And doesn't make sense to abandon them, so you have to re-engineer that. Think about that. Can it be aquacultural system? Can you grow things? There are people looking at it. In our MTech program, where 1/3 of the students are working on a new kind of ecological urban system for the Mekong River Valleys. It's where Angkor Wat was. Great civilization, great society, 1 million plus people also abandoned. So I think that there's an interest, for me there's an interest in these new systems, biological systems and the new territories, and how we rethink cities for that. And you know, I love the science of it, but I'm not a great designer of social spaces. I know fuck all about housing. There's loads and loads of stuff I can't do. I think what I'd like to do is try and persuade people around the world. These are places where we should be designing things.
I was curious about, obviously the threats with global warming, climate change, but resource scarcity, and are there teams or architects or urbanists modeling cities, running them through models that show reductions in critical resources? And is that a place?
Yes, it's very hard to get the data. The Norwegian government, for example, we know because if you look at the pattern of the grants that they give, are planning for great waves of immigrants in 50 years' time. Or at least somebody is thinking. I don't know the pattern of grants from NSF here. I do know the EU have some small work myself for them, contact with their chief science officer. Then on the information systems for cities, they're looking for exactly what you're doing. But you would think, yeah, everybody should be doing it, but they haven't begun. The concept of how to do it is not known. Urban metabolism, it's 50 years of work, and what it turns out to be is measuring the flow of energy through. You can get a nice diagram that shows you how much energy the US used last year in total. It's a kind of accounting. Nothing to do with relations of what happens if you move this city or change your shape, or move these people or do this or that. It's just it's like counting your electricity bills at the end of the year.
One other question. Has post-Darwinian or kind of selfish gene theory factored into your ideas about cities?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of Darwin, and I still read the Word of the Big Woods. Those of you who haven't, it's a great read. And Darwin was never quite the kind of single system guy that he historically claimed to be. You can find passages that suggest population equilibrium, although it doesn't call it that, that suggest changes in the population can be conserved genetically, which is kind of current thinking. If you look at the amount of numbers of people, the quantity of research and money invested, biology has been the dominant science in the last 100 years. In the last 20 or 30 years, of course, it's driven by the pharmaceutical industry, but also increasingly by new industrial products, by the oil industry. The smart money in the oil industry, they're not investing enough, but they're beginning to look at biologically produced energy systems. So all these things exist in bits and pieces. And for me, that's a little bit of work I'm doing is kind of looking at patterns in different systems of research and seeing how they come together. I don't think that's happening, and I would, I'm just kind of one-off guy. I would like to see governments do big stuff, but they're not. So that's the nightmare. And they'll let us talk forever, and they're not actually going to change. That's the nightmare.
Next question. I was wondering, having a look at your historical presentation, how the city? Yes, I have a book. So, how the city evolved and how we more or less managed with a lot of knowledge and know-how to construct a system that is actually not sustainable when we have a look at our population growth. So it's somehow
kind of fast-forwarded through that.
Yeah, so it's somehow amazing that we see how much knowledge went into it. And I was wondering.
I think cities myself stopped evolving around about 1860. And more or less you have everything there. Railway systems, big car, well, traffic systems, units and traffic systems, not cars of course. But you pretty much have the form of this. They just got bigger and kind of more expensive.
But my question is more about, so can you identify strategic interfaces? So if you want to invert this machine that is not really sustainable, can you identify strategies or techniques that are not completely redesigning the machine, but actually trying to get into strategic points that are really significant for the metabolism or for the current systems in place?
Yes, in some ways. I mean, the lesson from biology is there's no universal solution. Modernism is wrong in that sense. That everything depends on kind of locality and climatic context, and ultimately also cultural context will come with it. So there is no universal city in my mind. We've got used to the idea that there is. That's what I was taught and believed for a very long time, but I don't think so. So I think cities that did evolve, when we look more closely at older cities, historical examples, we can see a much better balance of the relation of spaces of social order with climate and ecology. But that's not permanent. It's not going to last. It's not, because climate has always changed. You know, I've shown a little bit in my book, but in my current research, climate has always changed. We made the change go faster, no doubt about that. But climate has always changed. So the idea that you've got one kind of city that you can spread over the world, I think doesn't. The idea has to be particularized. I know you're doing very good.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's great.